Okay, good morning for those of you still with us. On behalf of Lamar Associates Indian Country Training, I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar. This webinar is provided by grant number 2015 HEWXK056, awarded by the Office of Community Policing Services, U.S. Department of Justice. Today's webinar will be Community Policing, Engaging Youth in Community Policing. Let me start off by introducing myself. I'm Cindy Davis, Indian Country Training's Chief Operations Officer. I don't know why I'm so tongue-tied this morning, but before we get started, I'd like to go through a few features of this new platform to aid you in getting the full benefit of the webinar. At this time, please direct your attention to the chat bar. It's at the left of your screen. Most of you have discovered it. Should you have a question during the webinar, type your question at any time and send it to all presenters. Your questions will be answered in the order in which they are received. If we don't get to your question, we will during the 15-minute question and answer following the presentation. As Walt mentioned earlier, to the right of your screen, upper right, is a shaded broken square. That allows you to go full screen should some of the text be a little small while the webcam is up. Technical difficulties, we had a few going into this morning, so we love this platform and technology is great when it works. If you experience a technical issue and suffer a failure of connection, try calling in on your phone. But don't worry, a recorded version will be sent out post-webinar. Also, it sometimes is effective if you just close out your browser and re-log in, and sometimes that will also solve the problem. However, if we lose the webinar altogether, we will reschedule. Immediately following the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey and the technical assistance site. There you will find free online courses and resources to view. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. That allows us to improve what we're doing and also provide feedback to the COPS office. If there are multiple viewers participating today, if you would kindly email the names and titles to info@lamarassociates.net, we can get you added to the roster. And again, please note we will email you with a link to view and share the video presentation of this webinar to anyone that maybe can't join us today, and if you'd like to share it with your community. So with that, I think we've covered all of the technical and platform discussion. I'd like to introduce Walter Lamar. Mr. Lamar has 30 years of specialized law enforcement and security experience, having served as Special Agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Deputy Director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Law Enforcement Services, Senior Advisor to the Director of the Department of the Interior, Office of Law Enforcement and Security, and President and CEO of Lamar Associates Indian Country Training. He recently took a leave of absence, taking a temporary assignment with the Pentagon, and we're glad that Mr. Lamar is back with us. Walter is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet Nation of Montana and a descendant of the Wichita Tribe of Oklahoma. He was raised on the Blackfeet, Wind River, Jicarilla Apache, and Navajo reservations, in addition to Oklahoma Indian Country. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walter Lamar.
Well, thank you, Cindy. And to all of those that have signed on, welcome to this Lamar Associates Indian Country Training Institute webinar. We really appreciate the support of the COPS office, which is allowing us to be with you today. And yes, we've had a few technical difficulties already this morning, and we are totally dependent on technology, as Cindy said, to bring you this session. And sometimes that can be pretty wild. So if anything happens, as she said, it's going to be recorded, and you'll be able to view the recorded version on our website. But I will mention again, because I noticed there was a lot of folks that are signed on that signed on and then bounced off and were back on, which is an indication to me that could be a bandwidth issue. So shut down other programs on your computer. That'll help you some. I turned off my video. That should help elsewise. And kind of hate to do that because in Indian country, we like to see who's talking to us and expressions and eyes and so on. That's why we've always insisted on having a video, but there's a cost to it, and that cost is bandwidth. So I'm going to cut that off, and towards the end of the presentation, I'll try to get back on. So fingers crossed, everything goes okay today with the technology. And Cindy reminded me that, yeah, too, we're also in Mercury in retrograde, which is never a good thing. She talked about the chat bar, so please do use the chat bar if you would like. That's sometimes it's very helpful. It gives us an idea, number one, that you're still out there listening and that you may have a question or a comment. We'll usually wait until the last 30 minutes or so and allocate 30 minutes at the end of the hour for questions and such. But we will entertain questions if you think they have a bearing on the conversation and what I'm talking about. Then we'll entertain those. If you feel like I am off on some crazy tangent, I'm also willing to hear what you have to offer and get me squared away. So with that, I think it's always important. And if you've been, for those of you that have been with us on previous webinars, I always start out and thank you. And thank you for all your great work and dedication. You're the ones on the front line that see absolutely firsthand the issues that most only read about or hear about. And we know your sleepless nights, responding to a case or on standby, or when your mind is overwhelmed with what you're dealing with or what you've seen at work. We understand the heartbreak that you experience when you see the worst of the worst. And we can only imagine your pain when you're responding to the death of a child or the abuse of an elder. So I can't thank you enough for the work that you do. Only through, and I say this over and over in all of our webinars, it's only through hard work and communication partnership that we can enact positive change. I grew up on reservations, and Cindy mentioned that it's Blackfeet, Wind River, Jicarilla, Southern Pueblos, Navajo, and Oklahoma Indian Country. Nearly 18 years of my career has been dedicated to Indian Country law enforcement, security, and emergency preparedness. My immediate family and relatives live and work in Indian Country. So I didn't just read about and study Indian Country issues. I've lived them, I know them, I understand them. Based on my life and career, I sincerely believe that the answer to so many of our questions and difficulties lie in collaboration, communication, and coordination. It's definitely the way forward for our communities. And engaging youth in that process is so very important for long-term solutions. So before I get carried away and get started up, always in our communities, we look to start off in a good way. So I ask you to, in your own way, offer thoughts, words, positive energy as we look to those that have gone before us, those that offered prayers for our well-being. So our thoughts go out to them, asking for the necessary strength, guidance, and direction to make our communities healthy and safe. Let's just take a quick and quiet moment to think about that. For those having grown up, spent time in a tribal community, we've seen change even in our lifetimes. And I say even in our lifetimes. sometimes I forget that I'm 62 years old. So a lot of times when I'm speaking to folks, I'm the oldest in the room. But we have fewer fluent language speakers, changes in traditions, and we like to say the old way, fewer around that know that old way, which is, it's a stark reminder that every day bits and pieces of our culture, our identity disappear. And a key, as you know and we know, a key to community is identity. Therefore, we absolutely must strive to preserve our identity. But it's harder and harder to maintain language and tradition in this day and age. So it truly is up to us to carry on identity as best we can, to make sure the children of our communities are educated in the ways of our people, that they know their ancestors, that they hear stories and see pictures. People secure in their identity are much more willing to adhere to community accountability standards. If you know your relatives will be embarrassed by something you do, you're going to be less likely to do it. If you think no one cares, then what does it matter? And I'll go back to this picture real quick. On the left, that's my dad's mother, my grandmother, and on the right, that's Walter Lamar, my grandfather, and for whom I'm named. And I take a great responsibility for the fact that I carry his name, and I feel like I have a responsibility for as long as I'm around to be able to serve our communities. So today, and I mentioned this as we were preparing to start today, today is our fourth in a series of webinars. There are 5 in all, counting this one. The next and last webinar is scheduled in May, and that'll be putting community policing to work. So keep an eye out for the invitations with the dates and times, and we'll look forward to you joining us for that last webinar in this series. And let me mention at this point that we're in the process of developing an online course in conjunction with the COPS office that will allow you to explore these and related issues in the convenience of your office or home. And best of all, you can take all the time you need with the online versions, which have a lot more information with regard to links and research material. They direct you to the online courses, direct you to places on the website that you can gain all kinds of really valuable information, and you can explore, research, and dig deeper into these issues. One of the things Cindy and I were talking about as we were starting out today, this platform we're using, the webinar platform, just went through a series of changes and updates and upgrades. So we're getting used to that just as on the fly here, unfortunately. And Cindy, I'll mention when you're communicating with the vendor, you can also let them know that there's no longer the slides are no longer numbered. That's something else they probably should take a look at. Anyway, that's not your guys' worry, but we talked about in our first webinar, I've mentioned that everything's had to do with community policing. In our first webinar, Collaborating to Problem Solve, we talked about the basic elements of community policing. And community policing is defined as a philosophy that promotes organizational strategies which support the systematic use of partnerships and problem-solving techniques to proactively address the immediate conditions that give rise to public safety issues such as crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. Well, community policing is not a new concept, as you can imagine. It's been around for decades as cops have walked beats and been part of and working with and in the communities. But as law enforcement programs became modernized with cars and radios, less and less were cops out there on a beat. And so in the mid 1990s, community policing started becoming kind of institutionalized to bring that back to the communities where we had more interaction with police and community. Today, it continues to evolve as even more new technologies become more widely used and high-profile law enforcement events capture national attention. And we see a lot of those on television when there's loss of life, when there's a shooting incident, and we've seen the riots and such that follow that. Community policing is absolutely a tool that can be used to mitigate and prevent a lot of that from happening. Tribal police departments and the small self-governed communities, and we're talking about our communities because for the most part, they're small communities and that aren't served by our tribal law enforcement. I would say that we're very well suited for community policing because of that reason, because of our size and because of our close-knit nature. In this session, we want to concentrate on involving our youth in those concepts, ideas, and the implementation of community policing. The practice of community policing at its core is nothing more than how our tribal societies have maintained peace and order for time immemorial. In this session, we will talk about examples of collaborative community partnerships. And you know, you're going to hear me in the last, this whole series of webinars and throughout this webinar today, talking about collaborative community partnerships. Partnerships. So we're talking about these partnerships in tribal communities that advance community policing objectives and involve youth. After we finish today, you'll be able to describe some promising and best approaches that may be applied to a community policing issue that involves community youth in your community, in your tribal community. I was talking early on about the fact that there's no one size fits all across any country, that we are all unique and we have our own individual issues, and we need to tailor every program to our tribal communities. In our first series of webinars, we talked about community policing more in terms of a community wraparound concept. So I like community policing as a way to wrap around our community, as opposed to just a law enforcement specific concept. So when we say community policing, we immediately think law enforcement. I want to think of it more in terms of a community wraparound project. We want to continue with that community wraparound idea, but in this webinar, we are going to actually focus a little more on law enforcement participation and leadership. If you look in that first row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the right, that little scrawny guy actually happens to be me. But anyway, you know, community policing, it can be viewed as just another lame suggestion from some expert who has no idea of tribal community. And I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the people who've come up with this concept. Or you could choose just to give it lip service or dismiss it completely. But for those that recognize the value in bringing tradition, communication, and collaboration into your community to affect positive change, I believe this session will highlight the importance of partnering with community youth and recognizing they represent our future. Absolutely, right? They represent our future. Not only will we count on them in the future, we can harness their energy and creative thinking as we involve them with ongoing community issues. I think that is so absolutely important. We also want to use our influence in the community to acquaint our young people with the community service providers. When I was about 13 years old, that's when this picture was taken, our baseball team was coached by a Navajo police captain. We were the Window Rock deputies. And I'll tell you what, we were so very proud to wear that Navajo police patch on our sleeves. Captain Frank Atakai coached our baseball team. He didn't try to push anything down our throats. He'd sometimes show up in his uniform because he came straight from work. So we became familiar with and comfortable around a uniformed police officer. He was a positive role model. I mean, he was just a fine man and a very positive role model. And he used baseball to teach us life lessons. When I was about 15, a Navajo police cadet program was available to join, and of course I did. And once in the cadet program, we actually went on ride-alongs with police officers. We were exposed to real-life drama unfolding before our very eyes. As I think back about it, I guess liability back then wasn't what it is now, because that probably isn't real likely to happen, that you're going to be on a 15-year-old be on a ride-along and doing traffic stops and responding to domestic violence. But that was a different era. We still can use that same concept today, though. And because the goal of a cadet program or youth explorer program, police explorer program, is to acquaint youth with the duties and responsibilities of a police officer and to foster interest in law enforcement careers. Likewise, working with and being acquainted with other community service providers, we're giving our young people career options. So I would suggest to you, after a 25-year career in federal law enforcement, I'm guessing that maybe that opportunity to be a cadet and be coached by a police officer really did have an effect on my career choice. So, community policing, as I said, it's something our communities have done since time immemorial. Effective community collaborative partnerships, our collective goal and the very reason for this webinar series. Engaging youth in community policing, this particular webinar. And the topic for our discussion today will focus on everything we've talked about in this webinar series to this point relating to community policing, which fosters our ability to identify and address crime problems and their effect on our communities. As we have seen these pieces in place, we will then strive to engage the youth of the community to assist in the identification of community issues and to be involved addressing those issues. And I ask you, who is more informed of the day-to-day happenings in our communities? Who understands those issues better? Sadly, in some cases, they have been the victims of the very crimes that we're looking to address. Who can look at and examine the issues we face with fresh eyes, youthful enthusiasm, and then being, on top of that, totally familiar with the technology of today? Well, the youth of our communities, that's who can do it. And they indeed present, my goodness, an incredible resource. Hence, the reason that we're talking about advancing community policing objectives by involving our youth. We also want to talk about at-risk youth. What we can do as a community to provide a safety net for those most at risk. The Tribal Law and Order Act established a commission to study public safety issues in Indian country. And their final report was this statement: federal and state juvenile justice systems take Indian children who are the least well and make them the most incarcerated. So I want to take a second and let's jump back to this community policing definition, which referred to a major component of community policing to be problem solving. Now, we've covered this in every previous webinar, but just as a reminder, the SARA model is what we recommend as the go-to problem-solving process for our collaborative community coalitions and partnerships. Scanning. Scanning is simply problem identification and prioritization. Analysis. Understanding the problem and the effects on the community well-being. Response. Enacting steps to solve the issue. Assessment. How are we doing? How did we do? All right, and then we cycle back and circle back to scanning and then go through that process once again. My wife and I recently spent time with, excuse me, our 14-year-old niece from, and she's from a New Mexico Pueblo, and the Pueblo is policed by BIA. And then the Pueblos, they have traditional tribal officials who also perform unarmed activity to promote order in the community. I asked her, my niece, about law enforcement. She said, I really don't have an opinion because I've never met one in person. And we'll take that as, on one hand, kind of a good thing. On the other hand, it can be a little troublesome. I asked her, I said, what do they do? She said, they arrest people. I said, well, what else? Ride around in their cars. Okay, this is coming from a 14-year-old. I asked a teacher at the Pueblo school if they had any interaction with law enforcement. She explained they had a school resource officer for 1 year, but limited funding left it only at the 1 year. And while the officer was there, they just screened visitors and checked doors, make sure the doors are locked up. And if students got too rowdy, then the teachers would call an officer to come to intervene. That was the extent of the interaction with students. I'm going to tell you that's not what we're talking about today, that we want that broad and expanded and true interaction with youth in our communities. So I'll pose this question to you. How do the youth of your community view law enforcement? So part of this whole process, this whole community policing process, is establishing a strategy. Okay, we've got to establish a strategy, and part of that strategy is to engage youth in community policing. And it's going to require us to define our desired outcome. As every strategy does, we're looking for what that desired outcome is going to be. What is it we want from such a program? And I'm just going to offer this as an example. I'm not telling you this is how you should structure your program, because again, we talked about no one size fits all. But if I were putting together a strategy and thinking about my community, Blackfeet community, I would be thinking about part of the strategy I want to be prevention, to ensure that law enforcement and community service providers are working together, that we're working together in partnership to prevent community youth from becoming involved in criminal activity. Now I'm talking about this community policing strategy, the component that is youth focused. And then I'd be talking about intervention. Ensure that law enforcement and community service providers are working together. Again, you hear me say it again, working together in partnership to enact intervention initiatives when youth are suspected or arrested for criminal activity. It can't just be hook 'em and book 'em. Then we want to make sure that we've got respect and trust building. Shape the attitudes of youth and law enforcement to mitigate negative perceptions and preconceived notions. I'm talking about that by both police and youth, and we'll talk about that in a second. Community safety. We want to enlist community youth to offer thoughts and ideas on ways to make for a safer community and ensure their active support and involvement in those initiatives. And I'll say again and again, involvement. And then we want to serve at-risk youth, ensure positive, innovative, and best practices are engaged to serve that our community's at-risk youth. And I always like to think of it as that safety net, that wraparound, that we're thinking about them and we're going to be looking after them. So I want to go back to that question. How do the youth of your community view law enforcement? And to add to that, how does law enforcement in your community view youth? To gain answers, it just simply requires communication. And I over and over, as I think about it, it's like communication seems always the first thing to break down and not just in our communities, but all communities, not just our communities, but organizations. Communication, as simple as it is a very complex and a very difficult thing to maintain. So communication is something we've concentrated on significantly in this webinar series. We can foster that initial communication, talking about reaching out and figuring out what it is that our young people think about law enforcement. We can foster that initial communication using written questionnaires to establish a baseline or benchmark regarding attitudes and perceptions. Well, I got to tell you, and you know this if you've tried to put together such a questionnaire or survey, there's a bunch of them online that can be found that can serve as templates or give you ideas. But it's important that you, and I say this again and again, but it's important that you tailor the questions for your community to ensure you get the information that you want or need. And I always think it's best to ask questions that have a yes, no answer, true, false answer, multiple choice answer, questions that are answered with strongly agree, strongly disagree, those kinds of answers along with, in that continuum. So this keeps it simple, and the simpler, the quicker, and the more responses that'll be gathered. It's always got to be simple and quick, or we're not going to get the participation that we want. It's a fast-moving world these days, and people, because of technology, have very thin attention spans. An example of questions that you might want to pose, I'm just telling you, these are examples of questions. They're not, and I'm not suggesting these are the questions you would want to ask for your community. But again, these questions would be answered with that continuum: disagree, strongly disagree, slightly disagree, slightly agree, agree, or strongly agree. So think about those answers to these statements. My opinion of the police and the community is overall positive. In general, I respect the police. If I had knowledge of a crime, I would feel comfortable reporting it to the police. Police provide an adequate response to crime in our community. Police in our community respect youth. The community works well with law enforcement. And then you'd ask the question, I would want to ask the question, give them a chance to write a little something. What would you do to improve youth and police relations? That's where we start getting these ideas and these things, these initiatives we want to work on. And of course, we want to ask law enforcement and even some service providers some of the same questions. Youth in the community overall are cooperative, agree, disagree. Youth in the community have an appropriate level of respect for police officers. Youth in a community would likely come forward if they had knowledge of a crime. I think these are important components, and it's incredibly important for us to understand those perceptions and mindsets as we're moving ahead with our strategy and our plans to fully engage youth in our community policing. So, as I said, this isn't meant to be your survey, but just merely an example that would be used to create a benchmark or that starting point. Your survey doesn't need to be scientific analysis, but simply asking questions to gain an understanding. So don't get wrapped around the axle with creating questions, thinking it's got to be some scientific and set of questions, but just simply asking, what do we want to know, and let's ask about it. even asking folks to complete the questionnaire sends a message. And it's a message that you have an interest in what you think. And it's a message that, hey, something's going on, okay? That's a message that we're interested and something's going on. How do we get the respondents to complete questionnaires? Way back in the day at BIA, one of the captains of police actually took questionnaires and went to the grocery store, and with each sack of groceries that went out, one of the questionnaires was in that sack of groceries. And it was actually pretty incredible, the number of responses that we got. Well, we want to ask police those questions. Well, that's easy. We just, the boss gives them the survey and says, hey, we should answer these and leave it on my desk. For the youth, it means maybe going to the local schools and working with and through the school administrations to get the questionnaire circulated. So there's plenty of ways to do it. And again, just like everything else, it requires a little bit of thought, a little bit of preparation, and follow through to get it done. Well, obviously, if surveys show the attitudes and perceptions of law enforcement to be negative toward youth, then clearly we've got our work cut out for us, and our work starts right there to adjust those negative perceptions and attitudes. Because trust me, you know and I know, nothing is going to work in a community if our law enforcement officers have and maintain those kinds of attitudes. So for that, training is absolutely a good place to start with routine reinforcement of community policing philosophy by upper management. And that's going to serve to create that officer buy-in, absolutely critical. On the other hand, understanding the perceptions and attitudes of youth, well, that can create for us the direction that we need to take, and it'll give us an idea of the obstacles that we might face regarding the engagement in community policing. That's what I feel like we're going to get from those youth surveys. Indian country youth, connections through technology. Like everywhere, our youth enjoy communicating via technology, social media, text messaging, streaming video. So absolutely, we want to consider these platforms as we're working to engage our youth and keeping them informed. What better way to do it but through that very technology that they are so expert at. In our communities, we're looking for leadership. So by hosting academies, offering job training, internships, or workshops, again, we're talking about engaging youth, that encourage tribal youth to seek a professional career in law enforcement and a professional career in any of the other community areas where we have service providers. We got to host these different events to be able to support community policing by hiring from within the tribe. Our youth are willing to change. Native youth know what's wrong and have fresh ideas for solving problems. Oftentimes we just don't ever ask. When law enforcement engages young community members in community planning and discussion, the youth have more of a stake in supporting that outcome. And just like us, our youth walk in two worlds. And we've got to acknowledge the efforts and achievement of our youth who balance the traditions of our people with the complex skills required by modern life. And I got to tell you, sometimes in the face of some pretty serious adversity. By engaging youth in our community policing, we look forward to addressing a broad spectrum of community crime and quality of life issues. But the true strength of engaging youth with their unique perspective is addressing critical issues facing this fast-growing population of young people in our communities. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, youth under the age of 25 compose 41% of the entire Native population. We all notice that and know that our populations of our communities are younger and younger. When youth are involved in serving the community and engage in problem solving, the outcomes can be more sustainable because our youth will carry on for generations to come. Engaging youth in community policing, and then even though I mentioned early on that we're focusing more on law enforcement involvement, that doesn't mean we're leaving out the rest of the service provider community from this discussion. Quite the contrary. We're still talking about collaborative community partnerships, say it again. So we look to our young people to help address the issues of youth suicide, all forms of youth substance abuse, drug trafficking, underage smoking, human trafficking, domestic violence, runaways, bullying, school truancy, sexual abuse, graffiti, gangs, and youth involved in all types of, sadly, criminal activity. And just while I'm thinking about this, a quick point. All too often, and we all know this, that when adults and youth are in the same room, adults dominate the conversation and automatically take the lead. Right? We're going to take the lead and we're going to dominate the conversation. We have got to be cognizant of that dynamic and strive to establish an environment where youth are able to stand on equal footing and even take the lead in managing interaction with adults. We need to step back and give them space. And trust me, that's advice that surely I could use myself, because as I was talking to our niece last week, I found myself immediately started dominating the conversation. And what that means is lecturing. Start lecturing, do this, do that. This is how you live your life. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to do it. And I think we know that that's not going to be the way to approach it, but that's what we do. So this part, I say it's not uncommon that when we think of engaging youth, we decide, you know what, like a lot of things, we want to meet. And I just find it's the craziest thing in any country. We're always reinventing the wheel. So like a lot of things, we get excited saying, okay, we want to engage youth. Let me start thinking about ways that we can do that. And then we start going ahead and reinventing or inventing a wheel, create a new program, create a police explorers program. Let's create a youth police academy. Let's create a tribal youth advisory council. These types of programs, naturally and obviously, they can be of tremendous value. But man, I'm telling you what, they require a bunch of work to get off the ground and even more work to sustain. And you know this as well or better than I do. Our communities are littered with the remains of good idea programs that folded after a short time. So that even gives us an obstacle to overcome, because expectations are that when we're engaged in these processes that they're going to be short-lived because of history. So then what do? Well, you know what? Let's use what's there. Let's use what's there to start out with, for sure. And I always think student councils are a great place to start. Students who are recognized as leaders, they're voted into office by their peers. They gather for routine meetings. Engage that group. Boys and girls clubs, yet another place where the youth gather. Engage those groups. Unity, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, church youth groups, DOJ tribal youth programs, where youth gather. Engage those programs. And I got to tell you, this is kind of the point where I want to ask you, and you ask yourselves, do we routinely reach out to these groups and interact with the youth? If not, why not? Have we ever, that you know of in your community, gone to the student council at the school and had a mutually beneficial, excuse me, mutually beneficial discussion. But I got to tell you this, we can't wander off helter-skelter. All of this requires a plan of engagement, part of our overall community policing strategy. A disjointed message and ill-prepared approach, not understanding unintended consequences. I've always loved that phrase, unintended consequences, because trust me, every decision that I ever made as a manager in law enforcement, it had 3 or 4 always unintended consequences that, and sadly, in most cases, that I hadn't even thought of. Any form of aggressive strong arm tactic, we can't have it because it'll crush the potential benefit for interacting with youth. Kind of like me lecturing my niece. That was aggressive. I wouldn't want to call it strong arm, but it was aggressive nonetheless, and it was lecturing. That can only crush that benefit of interaction. Follow up and follow through. Follow up and follow through are critical. Follow up and follow through, right? So often we get a new broom approach. We're going to run out. We're going to have a meeting with the student council. We have this great meeting. Notes are taken. Expectations are created. And then crickets. Nothing. Follow up and follow through. Absolutely critical. Remember, community policing is working with the community in partnership to address issues of mutual concern. Okay, we've talked about venues for engaging youth, and the picture on this slide it has probably has nothing to do with the context. I just put it on here because I love the picture. I took it here in Washington, D.C. A month or so ago when folks came into town, water protectors came to town. So I love the picture. That's why it's there. No other reason. Okay, so we've talked about venues for engaging youth, and I think you probably already have some ideas what that might look like in your community, because I'm hoping that as we're talking, you're visualizing your community thinking, oh yeah, we've already got a group of youth that are engaged. We can work with them immediately. So we already know that staffing is going to have an impact. So we must be very thoughtful about prioritizing where we choose to engage. We can't be everywhere doing everything. So we've got to prioritize where to engage, basically to get the best return for our investment. And you know what? We've all been part of a rambling, bumbling meeting or session. And I'm hoping this isn't one of those times. So it's important for engaging youth that we're prepared with a plan to ensure direction and purpose, okay? So that we're prepared with this plan to ensure direction and purpose when we meet with our young people. They have a very keen sense for BS and insincerity, right? So we're not going to get by very long if we're BSing them or if we're not sincere about what we're doing. Respect and trust are key critical for these types of engagement and must be fostered and nurtured by both youth and adults. So we have got to have that trust and respect. Likewise, we've got to expect the same from the youth, and they have to recognize that that's our expectation. We want to empower the youth. We want to hand over the reins, and we want to ensure community equity. And this was something a phrase that years ago that I used to use a lot, community equity. And community equity is simply ownership. Youth must have a feeling of community ownership and belonging. If they don't have any community equity, then when they see graffiti sprayed all over the side of the building, do they care? No. If they have a feeling of ownership in a community and they see that graffiti sprayed on the side of a building, then they're going to have that same feeling of concern, disappointment that we feel. Community equity equals community ownership and belonging. Expectations are inevitable and they've got to be fulfilled. This simply means follow up and follow through. Okay, I could probably say nothing but that the whole rest of this webinar, and it would be the most important thing that I say. Follow up and follow through. To do anything less will kill any initiative. Momentum is built on action. Momentum is built on action. I think I might actually get that picture printed. So how does engagement with youth, how does that roll out? Okay, we're talking about engage with youth. How does that roll out? Well, you know what? We can. I'm not telling you this is what you got to do. I'm just telling you these are things that we could do. Design community activities that involve youth, and I'm talking involve, as active, meaningful participants. You know, the typical things, spring cleanup, graffiti cleanup. I got to tell you, I can't believe it over and over when I go to reservations that are just littered with graffiti. I think, my gosh, why isn't there an effort to clean that crap up? I mean, it's horrible, and we could use our youth to help us and to work to clean that graffiti up, because then they have a stake, they have ownership, community equity. How about elder visitation? Engaging our youth in that elder visitation so they can talk to those folks that have that understanding of tradition and who we are and identity. And maybe even youth-led technology training, right? The youth teaching community members to use computers. I really like that idea. Involve law enforcement with youth through sports, just like Coach Atakai did for us, and sponsorships for sports programs. Law enforcement should attend and participate, and I'm saying this, should attend and participate as appropriate in tribal cultural activity where youth are present. Again, we're wanting to serve as role models, but that's obviously only as appropriate. Organize a public listening session or sessions inviting tribal youth. Have a session particularly for tribal youth to invite them and have a listening session. Now, I got to tell you, this is where we got to start thinking about unintended consequences, and we got to understand what the contingencies look like. What if we have a listening session and people from two rival gangs show up at that listening session? What if we have a listening session and the youth have decided that they're going to heckle the law enforcement and raise Cain with law enforcement? So if we're doing those things, we got to be thinking ahead, and we got to be thinking about what that might look like, and if it were to happen, how we manage that in an appropriate, mature, and right way. You know, we, when I say we, Lamar Associates, in our early days, we actually were part of forming up a police explore program, and one of the initiatives was, hey, let's go just north of town and try to clean up that little lake out there. So boom, took young people out there and going to do it. Well, it wasn't almost as quick as we started that. Kids started finding used syringes, used condoms. For goodness sakes, this area was a biohazard, and we had to gather them up and get them out of there right away. That was, again, one of those things that was an unintended consequence. Nobody went out beforehand to take and look the area over to make sure that it was safe for bringing young people out there. In this slide, we see a Salt River police officer sharing a moment with a child. It reminds me of like the picture reminds me of like a Norman Rockwell kind of a poster. For adults, the officers have set up an opportunity at Salt River. They set this up, an opportunity for dialogue using coffee with the cop model for the adults to be able to engage with the police officers. And they extended this thing to pop with a cop for youth. Wow, I got to tell you, it's so simple, but so meaningful just to set some time aside to invite children over to have pop with a cop and get a chance to visit with a police officer. I think it's a great initiative out there at Salt River. At Gun Lake, Department of Public Safety, they actually take it back to hiring, bringing on people, and these graphics that are on these slides, they actually came from a Department of Justice publication that was drafted by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, who back in 2014 started working with 10 tribal law enforcement programs from across the country to find out about their initiatives and study what they were doing with regard to community policing. There was a final report in 2016. That's where these graphics came from. At Gun Lake, when they're hiring officers, they're looking for people that fit the community culture and understand the importance of community and the department's priorities, okay? And then those that have an aptitude for community engagement, they're looking for people that are going to be able to engage. And they take, for example, take an officer, because they want to find out about all the hobbies and their interests of these people they're hiring. So you take an officer who has as maybe a bicycle enthusiast, and you use them to facilitate a bike safety program for the community. That promotes as well officer buy-in, because you have an officer that's engaged in one of their passions. Officer buy-in equals officer satisfaction, and officer satisfaction equals officer retention. So not only are you looking at ways to, and Gun Lake has, looking at ways to engage with their community youth, they're also looking at this officer retention issue that all of us face in Indian country, high turnover. Officer buy-in equal officer satisfaction equal officer retention. So as I mentioned, with those high turnover rates at our police departments, we're always looking for ways to retain our officers. And also a graphic here, you probably can't read it, but at the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, school-based partnerships. So this is using a school resource officer employed by the tribal police department, and the officer is able to monitor then trends and attend to the needs of the youth. Not just being there shaking doors and monitoring visitors, but actually being able to be engaged with the youth. They have a Police Explorer post that was established, and they have a core group of 15 students that routinely attend these Police Explorer post meetings. The officer also there teaches the GREAT program, Gang Resistance Education and Training. And so this particular officer also spearheaded an effort to bring school officials together with other community service providers at bi-monthly meetings. Wow, collaborative community partnerships. Everything that we've been talking about in this webinar series is highlighted right there at the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. Back in September, I went up to Standing Rock and visited the camps. It was an incredible experience, and when I was there in September, there was a feeling and a movement that, and I don't want to go into all the dynamics, but I think there was. At some point, things kind of got a little bit sideways. But nonetheless, there's recently been a fair amount of media coverage that talks about the water protectors at Standing Rock at the camps. And they're giving a lot of credit for driving this early on initiative to youth. And all you got to do is you can Google. This is like that. This is circulated. I mean, this story is circulating everywhere. And if you just Google, you'll be able to find it. But this particular story talks about the importance for the youth who found a safe place, a place of respect, a place of belonging, and opportunity for meaningful activity, all wrapped in Native culture. So my takeaway from this is two things. Let's study the environment that fostered the engagement for youth. Let's figure out so we can replicate that dynamic in our communities. What fostered that engagement? How did that environment come to be where the young people, as you read these articles, talk about this safe place of respect, place of belonging, that they felt needed, all of these things that youth are seeking and searching for, they found there. Well, let's figure out what that looked like and how we can replicate it in our community. Secondly, let's bring home those youth who were fully engaged, use that energy and use that experience at home. I always talk about we've got all these pieces of the puzzle in our communities, and when we don't communicate, we don't talk, we're all individual pieces of the puzzle just hanging out there. But when we start that communication process, it brings us all together. Again, at Gun Lake, with half their tribal membership under the age of 18, the tribe clearly recognized the importance of engaging youth. And I guess I should have said this earlier, but engagement means both involving and serving. So engagement means we're involving the youth, but that doesn't take away the fact that we're still serving them. Even though we want to involve them, we still serve them. So we want to involve our youth and ensure that we're serving their needs. Engagement. So Gun Lake started a number of initiatives to engage youth: biking, sledding, sports, park activities. The key is to present the officers as mentors more than simply figures of authority, friends as opposed to foes. Okay, I'm looking at the time, and I just realized that I've already gone 3 minutes past the top of the hour. So I've got a few more slides that I'm going to try to go through these very quickly. So if you can bear with me and give me that latitude, I'd appreciate it very much. I try to be very strict about the time on these things, but sometimes I get carried away. So there you go. Okay, let's see. So this particular slide, those of you that have been on this webinar before, you might recognize this slide and have seen it from the previous webinar, but there's one difference. To this point, we hadn't specifically included youth. And, shame on me that it wasn't until we got to this webinar when I started recognizing that some of our past materials, we too have been guilty about not including and thinking about this most important community resource, and that being our youth. So I've attended so many meetings and organizations and events that have included all the players that are listed here except the youth. And think about that yourself. How many meetings you've been to, how many groups have you been to, community groups, action groups, and so on, and the youth aren't ever involved. We talk about the youth, but that's typically in the context of doing something for them, not doing something with them. So in other words, we've already talked about this, we structure events as we want them structured, then we want the youth to fit into that structure. Is that what we're talking about today? I hope that hasn't been the message. We want youth, our youth, to be an active part of that entire process, okay? And I'm going to hurry here. So at Fort McDowell, the Yavapai Nation, they have a tribal wellness program. So it presents an opportunity for alternative sentencing for our youth. It doesn't say so here, but if the youth are not part of the process, then and are only being monitored or plugged into a system that the service providers have designed, then guess what? The likelihood of that success is going to be very much diminished. We so need these alternative sentencing opportunities for our youth. So I say good work, Yavapai Nation. The photo you see here is it's from a video, and hopefully you watched that video. It's on our website, and when Cindy sent out the invitations, the first go round of invitations for our this webinar series, that video was included on it right here, and it's Chief Medina, Chief of Police at Laguna Pueblo. He talks about the work his department has done to encourage and recruit tribal members into law enforcement careers. And he looks at it as thinking long term, and he calls it working to replace ourselves with community members. So they're looking to be able to backfill all these law enforcement positions with community members. You know, one time I visited a tribal police department, it had nearly 160 sworn officers. Only one of them was a native officer. 160 sworn, one native officer. This was a tribal police department. So we need to bring our brightest and best into all aspects of our community provider cadre, okay, into all of those positions. You know what, I'm going to really bounce through this quick, but the cost of not engaging, I mean, we're talking in this slide about at-risk youth. It's an unacceptable cost by not engaging. You know what I'm talking about, and it's not just financial cost. Our youth get lost in both the state and federal judicial system, neither of which is equipped to specifically serve the needs of our youth. Engage our youth, save our youth. The consequences of our youth engaged in violent behavior, selling and using drugs, using alcohol, weed, lying to caregivers, running away from home, using weapons, failing to use birth control, multiple sex partners. They're all serious risk factors that we must recognize and engage our intervention resources. If not, these young people will surely be lost to an ill-equipped system. Simply said, jail must be an absolute resort for our youth. That means we must have alternatives in place which fits with what we have spent this entire morning talking about. You know what, and this is actually, it's a graphic from our online training course. That's kind of what it's going to look like. It'll be narrated and so on. But you know what it's talking about right here is hopelessness. Simple, straightforward hopelessness of our youth. And we have got to get them out of that hopelessness, give them hope, give them purpose, give them belonging, give them community equity, for goodness sakes. And as we know, in this slide, you probably can't read it, but Native youth who are not routinely involved in supervised activities, who lack significant connections to positive influences, role models, are more likely to be perpetrators and or victims of crimes. Hello, nothing new for us. We know that, right? So engage and save. All right, we're already 9 minutes after the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it quits, and I'm going to say, why don't we go to questions? If you have a question or a comment, you can feel free to type it into the chat bar. And I feel like I kind of rushed through that, but I'm very much hoping that that it was very clear what we're talking about and the importance of engaging youth. And when we talk about engaging youth, I'll say it again, not only engaging youth, but involving them in this process on equal footing. Cindy, I hear that you're back unmuted.
Because I'm banging away on my keyboard. Well, gosh, I am not seeing any questions, but we'll leave this open for a couple of minutes. I will just say, if something pops into your mind post-webinar, please feel free to give us a call and or send us an email, info@lamarassociates.net. We'll get back to you. If we don't have the answers, we'll try and find those answers for you, and we're here to support you And thank you, Walter. I think you've left us all inspired this morning to view youth in a very different way when it comes to plugging them into our community and problem solving.
Well, thank you, Cindy. And I want to thank everybody that joined us from across Indian country. And when we started out this morning, we had a person that signed on very early on who has been a law enforcement officer for 2 months and is going to be going to the Indian Police Academy before too awful long. And what I want to do is I want to wish that young man all the best and think about all the lives that you will have an opportunity to impact. And it makes me very, very excited for you. So I'm proud of you and excited for you.
Well, not seeing any questions. Walt, I think we'll conclude the webinar. We're still within our 15-minute question and answer, so you did fine keeping us on track this morning.
All right, well, good. All right.
This is a topic I think we could all talk about for hours and hours. So to conclude,
I'm not sure.
I just want to remind everyone, we will email you all with, as I mentioned, any unaddressed questions. Also a link to view this video presentation. You are welcome to share it and or host community meetings with it or roundtable discussions with it. I think it will inspire more people to get involved. Please be sure to complete the survey that you'll be directed to. This helps us improve what we're doing and also give feedback to the COPS office. You will be directed to that immediately following the end of the broadcast. With nothing else to say, unless Walt, you have a closing comment, we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Well, just thank you again for joining us and thank you for the hard work you do.